Good morning. Welcome to another episode of our CyberArk podcast. Today, we are very honored to have Brian Murphy to join us on the show. Hi, Brian. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Jeffrey. How are you?
I am feeling superb. It's always great to see you and talk to you again. And, for audience who might not know who you are, would you like to do a quick introduction?
Absolutely. Let me start off by saying thanks for having me. So a little bit about myself. I run consulting services for CyberArk, as well as a newly founded team of remediation services. In addition to that, I'm the founder of the Guardian training class that we host for our partners right now, as well as a member of the Blueprint team that contributed to the design and the input that went into this framework for our customers. I've been working in security for over just about 20 years, over 10 at CyberArk, and I've led the consulting team for the last 5+ years as well.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm very curious. How was your involvement with? I know you are one of the founders of the Blueprint. Would you like to share with us, your experience, your contributions to the Blueprint?
Absolutely. We put together this framework to help customers move away from having to guess what to do when. Because what we found is customers struggled with the identification and prioritization of what to do first, second, and third. And if everything's a priority, then really nothing's a priority because we can't be laser focused on how we reduce risk. So what we did is we talked to several different teams within CyberArk, including our pre-sales and our post-sales teams, to bring in input. But what I want to focus on here is that we also brought in the remediation experience we had, so that if a customer had an incident or a customer asked us to help them come fix some of the security incidents they had within the organization, we took that knowledge as well and applied it to the Blueprint so that our customers could gain from that experience and help reduce risk within their organization.
Thanks, Brian. So one of the common questions that we get is, even internally, is what's the difference between incident remediation and incident response? A lot of them just refer to this as IR. So, from your experience, would you be able to share what's the difference between incident response and incident remediation?
Absolutely, Jeffrey. It's a great question because, again, we kind of lump them all into one bucket. And what the difference is that incident response is responding when there's an actual situation. So if you take it from a natural disaster perspective, this is when the natural disaster is actually happening. So we're actively in the situation. Things could still be very, very fluid at that point. So in a security incident, we're at the point where the attacker still may be doing things. They still may have full access to the network. So that's the incident response. It's about, if you look here and you do the detection, the containment, it's during those phases. What CyberArk doesn't want to do is we don't want to be that lead to detect and tell you how the attacker got in. We want to work on the remediation. And where we come in is on the eradication phase and the recovery or the remediation, depending on how you look at it. What we want to do is help the IR team put in additional controls, put in the boundaries to block the attacker, to move the attacker out, and also apply these strong security controls so that after we're done, the customer has a better security posture. Now, this is where sometimes customers will call us and say, hey, I have an attacker on my network. What should I do? Can you guys help block or do this? This is where we want to work with those teams collectively, because what we find is you get a remediation report when you work with an IR company. And a little segue here for you, Jeffrey. But what comes out of these remediation reports is a list of things the customer can do better to prevent this from happening in the future. And it's written in several phases, such as here's what you do in 30 days, here's what you do the next 60 days to get you to that 90-day point, and then here's your long-term plan. If you ever look at one of these reports, you find that around 40 to 50% of it is all around privilege management. And when our team comes in, we can assist by taking that burden off the customer and actually assisting with figuring out the remediation, boots on the ground, helping people do the work to free up the customer staff to work on the other 50 to 60% that they have to do based on that remediation report.
Thanks, Brian. So I think a lot of customers would be very interested to know how did all this get started? How did incident remediation services get started in the first place?
Sure. So how this got started was our customers, unfortunately, started to call us and say, we're in an active situation. We're in that containment phase. We need CyberArk's help to get these accounts managed and under control. So with my predecessor that ran the team, we started to take this role on because he and I had the experience to do remediation work from a previous life. So while it wasn't something that organically grew from the company, it came out of need, and we started to help our customers in those situations. And what we found is that the security incidents allowed us the freedom to do exactly what the customer needed without the boundaries, the red tape to get things done. And the customers were really impressed that we could get sometimes something that would take 6 months to a year done in about 30 days. So we were able to build a framework to rapidly do things for our customers. And this is that intel and that input that we started to put into our blueprint so that every customer could take advantage of our learnings from doing remediation work.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm just curious, how do our customers, get into a situation where they will need incident remediation?
It's unfortunately pretty easy. And the reason it's so easy is that when you look at it, we as security professionals have to be right 100% of the time. But the attacker only needs to be right once. And we'll talk about this a little more in detail when we go through maybe some scenarios later, Jeffrey. But for right now, the biggest challenge is overprivilege, administrative access, things of that nature will be in the environment, and it just takes the attacker getting you to click on something when you have administrative privileges running, or a vulnerability within software that allows them into the network, and then they can slide around with their access and then end up taking over your full enterprise.
So, Brian, I think one of the first questions customers will ask is, okay, I'm interested in incident remediation, but what credentials, what track records do we have that we will have a valuable offering for our incident remediation services?
So the offering that we're putting together is we're putting together a statement of work to have a predefined number of days with resources to work with your IR team, whether it be external or internal, for a security incident. And the idea here is we're preparing. One of the biggest things you can do for an incident is be prepared. Preparation is key. So as part of the preparation for our customers, we want to offer a service where they don't have to guess and say, what do I need from CyberArk? How can I get them in here? It's just we've figured out the paperwork. We understand what we have, how we're going to use it. We just don't know what the tasks are yet because we're not preparing for an actual incident. This allows us the flexibility to come in there, make the recommendations, move the customer forward, and start securing credentials right away instead of us having to wait for paperwork to be done.
So just now you mentioned about scenarios, and I thought this would be a good time for you to share some war stories with us, right? How does our remediation services help our customers, and what kind of benefits they get out of this engagement?
Sounds good, Jeffrey. Let's talk about right now this one. It's an interesting one because I think when we talk about incident response, we make the assumption that the sky has fallen, everything was bad. And I'll spoiler alert on this one, the attacker took over the entire domain, but they did nothing. They were just sitting there waiting. So the customer caught this in time so that they didn't do anything malicious, but it still proves the point that the attacker had full administrative access to the domain and several other assets within their enterprise. So let's talk a little bit about how that happened. And to start, we have our attacker here. And what he did is the attacker posted a malicious document. If I recall correctly, it was a resume. So someone was looking for possible candidates to come work for them. They clicked on the document. Malware ran on their machine. Normally, this wouldn't be a problem if the user was an administrator of their system. But in this case, this person was. So since they were administrator, code execution, they were able to gain full access to the system. Once they did that, They went ahead and stole the credentials to the domain and used the VPN to connect in whenever they wanted to this enterprise network. Now, I'm sure us as security professionals were thinking, well, why didn't they just have multi-factor blocking that? Valid point. This was one of the security controls they missed, that as part of the outcome of the remediation, they did put multi-factor on the VPN. But at this time, they didn't have it, so the attacker could authenticate right in with the stolen credentials. Once the attacker got in, the stolen credentials didn't get him very far. It just gave him access to the network. What he ended up doing was rummaging around through different servers, jumping from system to system until he found a service account. When he found the service account, it was in the domain administrators group. So now at this point, he had a password that he knew wasn't going to change, and he got administrative access to the domain. So we would think that's where he stopped, but he didn't. He kept going, and he tried to get access to the SQL database, to the customer information that they had. And we saw in the logs working with the IR firm that they were able to do this. But where the story gets interesting is that this was a attack that was automated from the standpoint of downloading the malware. But then you could see, just like we have different levels of resources in security, they had different levels of resources in the attackers. And you could see in the log that it said, I tried this command, it didn't work, waiting on escalation. So they actually had another team they were waiting on to come in and to execute the attacks. But during that waiting period is when this customer discovered that this attack was going on. So this is why the attacker didn't fully carry out their mission, and the customer was able to get them out before any real damage was done.
Thanks, Brian. This is always great to see a success story. Most of the time, when we hear about war stories, it's always about devastation, and they end up in the news. I think this is a great story to show that, hey, we've got the right processes, the right ability to react in time, then you might be able to avert, disaster.
Absolutely. I think this one rings a little more true for people today, just because of the fact that we're hearing so much more about ransomware within the industry, and it seems as if every attack right now is another ransomware attack. So on this one here, the ransomware wasn't, the attacker didn't come in and just compromise a workstation. What they did is they found that the outside had a weak password to one of the servers in the DMZ. They were able to crack that password, connect to the system, fish around for administrative credentials on that system. They gained those administrative credentials, moved around the domain then until they were able to get inside the internal network and grab the domain admin credentials. Once they had those, they didn't stop there. They used SCCM to deploy ransomware across the enterprise. And when they do this, they say, critical security patch, go. And SCCM pushes it out, everybody installs it, and they force a reboot. So this customer lost all of their machines. They lost their hypervisor infrastructure as well. And if you're familiar with some of the more common ransomwares out there, such as Maze and Ryuk as well, you'll see that they don't just deploy the security patch. They'll go in, they'll disable your antivirus, they'll disable your backups. They'll actually try to encrypt or delete your backups so you can't restore. They'll also look if you have hypervisor infrastructure and try to compromise that as well, trying to make sure that they maximize the impact to force the customer to pay the ransom to decrypt the information. So in this scenario, they actually did encrypt the hypervisors. And the reason they could is because the hypervisor authentication was domain joined. It wasn't standalone. They were able to get to every system, to every backup, that when we came there, this was a pre-COVID one. So it predates the COVID era where we all had to work remotely. So we were on site. When we were on site for this, what we actually did is they gave us a key card and said, go take the server and just go install it in a rack because the sky was falling. They didn't even check who we were. They didn't care. They said, we just need help. Security's out the window. We're sort of trusting everyone, and we'll pick up the pieces later. So it really speaks to the point that when this stuff hits, if you're not prepared, which this customer was not, they didn't have proper processes in place to restore the business, and they were actually having conversations about, do I restore the network and bring email up first, or do I bring up payroll to pay the people who are doing the work for me? And they had to make those decisions in real time going through this incident instead of having a prepared plan to know what to do first, second, and third. So while our blueprint is not going to go to that detail on what services to restore first, understand that that methodology is built in here to say, manage this account first, second, and third as you're going through your privileged account management lifecycle.
What benefits did the customer get with our advice? Did they, get a reduction in time, reduction in efforts?
We offloaded everything for them. They didn't have to install, they didn't have to configure, they didn't have to manage any accounts. We came in and said, this is what we're doing, give us a domain credential, and we're going to go out there and pull these type of accounts into the system. So we did that day one. The customer didn't have to do it, and we showed them the new process of how they're going to use their credentials going forward. And within a week, we had everyone using CyberArk for secure access to servers as well as to domain controllers.
So just out of curiosity, if they didn't engage us or they didn't use CyberArk, how much time would it have taken to do the same thing?
It really depends, because in order to do this, it's about account creation, distributing passwords, making sure that those passwords aren't compromised again based on the attack. And because of how CyberArk works, I would probably estimate that they save themselves anywhere from about 4 to 6 weeks worth of work by using CyberArk instead of doing this on their own.
Wow, that's a great story. So for our customers, our partners out there, do you have any advice for them, right, from all this experience that we have had?
I do. And I would say from an advice perspective, one of the biggest things we can do in the short term is just making sure service accounts are not in domain administrators group. And it sounds very simple to say that, and it's really not. 2 examples I can give you. One's a little older. One happened to me about a month and a half ago. So the first one, it's a little older, is the customer had to send the password to the vendor. The vendor encrypted the password into the license file. And if you ever changed the password, your license broke on the application. But the interesting thing was they required domain admin access when you sent it over to them so their application could function. And that version of software was so old, they couldn't get a new license file. So the customer had a critical piece of software they couldn't update, they couldn't do this with, and it had domain admin access where they couldn't change the password. So right there, they had several things they could have done better to make sure the attack didn't happen. The second I saw, same thing, account in domain administrators for a service account. This one didn't require the password, but what it did is it did a check to make sure it was a member of the domain admins group. If it wasn't, the software would fail to run. They actually had a check in their code to make sure they were in domain admins. So they're following bad security practices, and it's not to call it the software to say every software does this. I think we're in an era where that's few and far between. But the point here is that keeping service accounts out of the domain administrators group is a good first step in mitigating some of these attacks. We're just making it harder on the attacker to get that domain admin access.
Thanks for sharing that. Any other advice that you think our customers and partners should have or take away?
Yeah, I think it's be ready. Have the conversation with your internal teams, your IR teams. Practice the exercise. Understand who's going to be on the short list to call if an incident arises. Because the last thing you want to do is be scrambling to say, what should I do when an incident happens? You think about it, it's just like our first responders. If we have any sort of catastrophic or tragic event happen within the world, these first responders are training every day to make sure they know how to respond to it. So when the incident happens, they're not guessing what to do. They go into a reactive mode and do what's needed. We need to be that diligent when it comes to security for our customers and for our internal organizations as well.
So, Brian, I think one of the most common feedback that we have from customers that when there's an incident, they need to keep things confidential, right? They can't disclose, but at the same time, they want to engage experts So they have to go through this tedious, legal paperwork and potentially even the contractual arrangements. So, how do we overcome that?
That's the beauty of the service and part of the offering we have is that paperwork will be done first. Now, the challenge is when you have cybersecurity insurance or you have a third-party legal entity that's owning the security incident for you, the customer, it's not about having the agreement between CyberArk and customer. We need to have it with the person or the entity that's owning the incident. And that's not hard to do. If we have the paperwork in place from our side between CyberArk and the customer, when the incident happens, the law firm takes over the incident, they just say, who do you have on retainer? Who are you working with? The customer will turn all those documents over and just contact CyberArk directly and say, we need an agreement in place between us and you so that we can talk about and work these security incidents. So again, the preparation here is key because if we can turn this over to the law firm, those conversations can happen immediately and we don't have to wait 2, 3, 4 weeks when we're in an incident to figure out how we can help. Jeffrey, one more point to that is if we don't do this and we don't come into the incidents, I'll give you another scenario that happened to us as well, is that a customer came in and said, we had an incident, come help us. But we can't tell you about it. So we just want you to tell us what you would do from a best practice. So we did. And we spent 2 days with this customer going through how you manage domain admin, how you follow the blueprint steps, stages 1, 2, 3. Had this whole conversation, got done with the meetings. We were getting ready to board our flight to go home. And the customer goes, hey, Brian, come here. I want to check this out. Yeah, what's this? He goes in the whiteboard. Here's what happened. And what he says is he goes, the attacker came in through this application, came in through the DMZ, and compromised this one only database. So basically what we did is we spent 2 days preaching about securing Active Directory, and the incident had nothing to do with impacting Active Directory. So everything we said wasn't tailored to their specific needs at that time, and we missed the mark for that customer because we didn't have the knowledge to make the right recommendations.
So I think having a retainer in this case, right, the preemptive agreements will make things a lot faster. We don't have to spend 2 days talk about things that would otherwise be, the same time and effort could have been targeted towards exactly what's that problem and how to solve it.
Absolutely. And this is probably the biggest struggle that this team I'm setting up is having right now is understanding how to talk to the lawyers, understanding what they can and can't say, and helping the customers who are frantic in a situation, help them recognize that we can assist if they get us in contact with the right people. And a lot of times they may not even know who the right people are. So you can start to see how this slows down the process to where it takes time for us to get engaged at the right levels to really bring that value add the customer's looking for.
Thanks, Brian. So before we close this off, just would like to share, so if a customer is interested or partner is interested, how do we engage the remediation services team?
So if you want to engage the remediation services team, the best thing I tell you to do is reach out to your local account exec. Start talking to them about the service offering. We have a solution brief we can send you. We also have a statement of work that you can run through to understand what's going to be involved, what's going to be the initial offering that we do, how much it's going to cost, so everything's defined up front that we can prepare. So this is on the preparation side. We can have this done. We'll have the NDA agreements in place. All of that will be done ahead of time. But if you should find yourself in an incident where you need our assistance, there's really 2 ways to get a hold of us. One, you can send an email to incidents@cyberark.com or open a case or call technical support and say, I want to leverage this, or I have an incident I need to engage. They understand the procedures and protocol to engage my team to make sure we can assist you and get someone working with you very, very quickly to help assist in these situations.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to have you in this podcast with us. And I look forward to having you on our podcast again sometime in the future.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Brian. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.